Good day to all of you. I am Doctor Romel Bayot, and I was tasked to talk on chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. Based on the Global Strategy for Diagnosis, Management, and Prevention of COPD, COPD is defined as a common, preventable, and treatable disease characterized by persistent respiratory symptoms and airflow limitation that is due to airway and/or alveolar abnormalities usually caused by significant exposure to noxious particles or gases. COPD can be prevented by not smoking or be exposed to noxious particles or gases, and COPD is treatable with the use of bronchodilators and corticosteroids, but up to this day, COPD is not yet curable. It is only treatable. Under COPD, you have three distinct pulmonary conditions. First is your emphysema, second your chronic bronchitis, and third is your small airway disease. Emphysema is an anatomically defined condition characterized by the destruction of the lung alveoli with airspace enlargement. Chronic bronchitis is a clinical definition. It is defined as cough with sputum expectoration for at least 3 months in a year during a period of 2 consecutive years. Third is your small airway disease, which is a condition in which the small bronchioles are narrowed and reduced in number. The pathogenesis of emphysema is more clearly defined than that of the small airways disease. The current paradigm comprises 4 interrelated events. First is your chronic exposure to cigarette smoke, which triggers inflammatory and immune cell recruitment within airways and air spaces of the lung. Second, the inflammatory cells release proteinases, which cause damage to the extracellular matrix. Third is the structural cell death. Through oxidant-induced damage, cellular senescence, and loss of extracellular matrix attachments. Fourth is the disordered repair of elastin and extracellular matrix, contributing to the abnormal airspace enlargement and emphysema. To further illustrate the pathogenesis of emphysema, it starts with the long-term exposure to cigarette smoke, which is the most common risk factor for the development of COPD in a genetically susceptible individual. So this will trigger the lung epithelial cells, the T and B lymphocytes, to recruit inflammatory cells like your macrophages and your neutrophils into the lung. The macrophages will secrete inflammatory mediators like your proteases, example of which is your neutrophil elastase and your metalloproteinases. These proteinases or proteases will tip the balance between the protease and the antiproteases in favor of the proteases, which will lead to extracellular matrix destruction. The neutrophils will secrete oxidants like your NF-kappa beta, which will lead to oxidative stress and chronic inflammation. Other biological pathways involve apoptosis, which leads to cell death and abnormal repair of the elastin and extracellular matrix, leading to abnormal airway enlargement and emphysema. What are the pathologic abnormalities that we can see in COPD? Cigarette smoke exposure may affect the large airways, the small airways, and likewise the alveoli. These are the changes that we can see in the large airways. First is mucous gland hypertrophy and goblet cell hyperplasia, leading to chronic cough and sputum production, which is typical of your chronic bronchitis. Second is squamous metaplasia, which is a predisposing lesion to lung cancer. Third is smooth muscle hypertrophy and bronchial hyperactivity, leading to airflow limitation. The small airways, which is less than 2 millimeters in diameter, is the major site of increased airway resistance. The characteristic changes that we can see in the small airways are goblet cell metaplasia, smooth muscle hypertrophy, luminal narrowing by fibrosis, excess mucus, edema, and cellular infiltration. The characteristic pathologic abnormality in the lung parenchyma is emphysema. It is characterized by the destruction of gas-exchanging air spaces. It also involves the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and the alveoli itself. Also, the alveolar walls become perforated and later on obliterated with coalescence into large emphysematous air spaces, which is now termed as your bulla. Likewise, there are large numbers of macrophages that accumulate in the respiratory bronchioles. The neutrophils, the CD8 lymphocytes are also increased in the alveolar space. Central to the pathophysiology of COPD is airway inflammation and airflow obstruction. When you do spirometry, there is a reduction in your forced expiratory flow rates, reduced FEV1 and FEV1 over FVC ratio, which seldom show a large response or bronchodilator response after inhaled bronchodilator. When you do lung volume study, there is an increase in residual volume because of air trapping. There will be an increase in your TLC or your total lung capacity because of progressive hyperinflation, which can occur late in the disease. The PaO2 usually remains normal until the FEV1 is decreased to 50% of predicted. So if you have a COPD patient with a spirometric finding of an FEV1 less than 50% predicted, expectedly the patient would be hypoxemic and the PaO2 would be less than 80 millimeters mercury. An elevation of the PaCO2 is not expected until the FEV1 is less than 20% predicted. So if a COPD patient has an FEV1 of a less than 25% predicted, he is prone to develop hypercapnic respiratory failure. Likewise, there is non-uniform distribution of ventilation and ventilation perfusion mismatching also occur. The ventilation perfusion mismatching is the most common cause of hypoxemia in patients with COPD. These are the risk factors for the development of COPD. You have your environmental and individual risk factors. Environmental risk factors include your smoking, which is the most common cause of COPD, biomass fuel exposure, occupational exposure, and outdoor air pollution. Individual risk factors include genetic predisposition, asthma and airway hyperactivity, and recurrent infections. In general, cigarette smoking is the major risk factor for mortality, and it is also the major risk factor for the development of COPD. There is a dose-response relationship of FEV1 decline and intensity of smoking, meaning the higher the number of pack years smoking history, the faster is the decline in your FEV1. Another risk factor is airway hyperresponsiveness. Many patients with COPD also have airway hyperresponsiveness, especially true for childhood asthmatics who become chronic smokers. Third are your respiratory infections, either recurrent viral or bacterial infections, which are important cause of your exacerbations of your COPD. Other risk factors include occupational exposures, exposure to dust and fumes at work, have been implicated as risk factors for chronic airflow obstruction. Another risk factor is your ambient air pollution. Prolonged exposure to biomass combustion is a significant risk factor for women. Another risk factor is passive or secondhand smoke, example of which is your exposure of children to maternal smoking, and also exposure of wives to their husbands who are smokers. Individual risk factor include severe alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which is a proven genetic risk factor for the development of COPD. This is a graphical illustration of the natural history of lung function decline among non-smokers and smokers. The x-axis is the age in years, the y-axis is the FEV1. As we grow older, our lungs and its lung function mature also. The FEV1 reached normal level at age 20. Curve A is the normal pattern of growth and decline of lung function. Normally, FEV1 decreases by an average of 30 ml per year. In curve C, the brown curve, there is a reduced pulmonary function growth phase. The FEV1 is less than 65% predicted at age 20, with a normal rate of decline. This can be due to a developmental problem in the lungs or due to recurrent childhood infections. In curve B, there is a normal pattern of growth with an early initiation of lung function decline, which can be due to cigarette smoking. Although there is an early decline in lung function, it is not at an accelerated rate. This curve is compatible with smokers who has quit early on, which prevented the accelerated decline in lung function. So if any one of you are smokers, it's high time to quit now to prevent an accelerated rate of lung function decline. In curve D, there is a normal growth followed by an accelerated decline in lung function, with FEV1 reaching below 50% predicted at age 65 years, meaning at this age, he is symptomatic with cough, shortness of breath, and hypoxemia. This is the curve for smokers who did not quit early on or have quit very late already. You have to quit now, for tomorrow may be too late. When you get the history of a patient with COPD, the most frequent symptoms would be cough, sputum production, and exertional dyspnea manifested as increased effort to breathe, chest heaviness, air hunger, or gasping. The dyspnea worsens as COPD advances. Likewise, there is an increasing frequency of exacerbations, and sometimes resting hypoxemia will occur, which will require supplemental oxygen therapy. Physical examination findings may be normal in the early stages of COPD. In more severe or advanced stage of COPD, there is a prolonged expiratory phase with expiratory wheezing on auscultation. There is barrel chest on inspection with the use of accessory muscles of respiration. Oftentimes, COPD patients, especially those in acute exacerbation, would assume a tripod position to facilitate the use of sternocleidomastoid, scalene, and intercostal muscles. There is cyanosis of the lips and nail beds, and most patients have elements of both emphysema and chronic bronchitis. These are the features of a COPD with predominantly emphysema. They would manifest with exertional dyspnea and scanty mucoid sputum. On physical examination, they are the so-called pink puffers. They are asthenic with barrel chest, tachypnic with pursed lip breathing, with decreased breath sounds or distant breath sounds, hyperresonance on percussion, and they are non-cyanotic. In contrast, these are the features of a COPD patient predominantly chronic bronchitis. Usually, they are heavy, with chronic cough and copious purulent sputum, and they are less dyspneic compared to emphysematous patients. On physical examination, they are the so-called blue bloaters. On auscultation, you will hear crackles and wheezes. They are cyanotic, and cor pulmonale will occur early in the course. The diagnosis of COPD is based on the presence of symptoms of shortness of breath, chronic cough and sputum production, and the presence of exposure to risk factors like tobacco, occupational exposure, indoor or outdoor pollution, and spirometric findings compatible with COPD. So, spirometry is required to establish the diagnosis of COPD. Without spirometry, you cannot diagnose a patient having these symptoms and with exposure to these risk factors as having COPD. You will just have to label it as COPD suspect. This is a spirometer. This is an old or crude way of doing spirometry. Spirometer records the ventilatory event wherein the x-axis is time while the y-axis is volume. Inspiration is recorded as an upward deflection while expiration is recorded as a downward deflection. What is the breathing maneuver during spirometry testing? After tidal breathing, we ask the patient to forcefully inspire to total lung capacity, then forcefully expire down to residual volume. Once the patient is at residual volume, we ask him to forcefully inspire back to total lung capacity, then do several tidal breathing. This maneuver is known as the forced vital capacity maneuver. Basically, from the tracing made during the test, we can measure the volume expired from total lung capacity till residual volume, which is known as forced vital capacity. In this tracing, the volume expired by the patient is 6 liters. In spirometry, the measured parameter can be classified as a volume or a flow parameter. FVC is classified as a volume parameter. Likewise, since we are recording time, we can measure the volume expired in 1 second. This is known as the FEV1. FEV1 is considered as a flow rate parameter. Since we can directly measure FEV1 and FVC, we can compute for the FEV1 over FVC ratio. This is classified as a flow rate parameter. It is quite important that you memorize the normal configuration of a flow volume loop. As you are going to see later, it plays a pivotal role in the interpretation of the spirometry. Initially, at total lung capacity, just before forced expiration, the flow rate is 0. As the subject forcefully expires, a peak flow rate is readily achieved. As the subject continually expires to residual volume, the flow rate decreases linearly. As the subject forcefully inhales back to total lung capacity, the flow rate is most rapid during the mid-inspiration. That is why you have this U configuration of the inspiratory loop. The loop is helpful in classifying the ventilatory defect. The loop may be normal or abnormal. If the loop is abnormal, it could either be an obstructive or restrictive ventilatory defect. Question: in a restrictive ventilatory defect wherein the main manifestation is a diminution of the lung volume, which part of the flow volume loop will be affected? The y-axis, which is the flow rate, or x-axis, which is volume? So, the x-axis is the one which is affected. The flow volume loop in a restrictive lung defect tends to be thin. In a restrictive lung defect caused by a parenchymal problem or problems in the alveoli or interstitium, the loop will tend to be thin and tall. If the problem is extra-parenchymal or pathology in the pleura, neuromuscular, or thoracic cage, the loop will tend to be narrow and short. Question: in an obstructive ventilatory defect wherein the main manifestation is a diminution of flow rate, which part of the flow volume loop will be affected? The y-axis, which is the flow rate, or the x-axis, which is volume? The y-axis will be affected. The flow volume loop in an obstructive lung defect tends to be short. If the obstruction is distal to the mainstem bronchus, it is classified as a lower type of obstruction, and usually they manifest with a scooped out pattern of expiratory part of the loop. If the obstruction is proximal to the mainstem bronchus, it is classified as an upper type of obstruction, and usually they manifest with flattening of inspiratory and or expiratory part of the loop. If the obstruction is permanent, the flattening occurs on both parts of the loop. If the obstruction is variable, the flattening will depend whether the obstruction is intra or extrathoracic. If the obstruction is variable intrathoracic, the flattening will occur during expiration. If the obstruction is variable extrathoracic, the flattening will occur during inspiration. Let us now interpret the spirometry using this algorithm. First, you have to establish whether the spirogram is acceptable. Then you have to look at the loop pattern, whether it is that of an obstructive or a restrictive ventilatory defect. Then you have to verify the numbers or the values of the parameters. The first parameter you have to look at is the FEV1 over FVC ratio. Is the FEV1 over FVC ratio low? If it is low, then it can either be an obstructive or a combination of an obstructive and a restrictive ventilatory defect. To verify, you have to look at the value of the FVC. If the FVC is low, then it is either an obstructive ventilatory defect or a combination of an obstructive and a restrictive ventilatory defect. You have to do a lung volume studies to determine the value of the total lung capacity. A normal total lung capacity will rule out the presence of restrictive ventilatory defect. If the FVC is normal or it is not low, then it is an obstructive ventilatory defect. Meaning to say, an obstructive ventilatory defect, you have a low FEV1 over FVC ratio with a normal FVC. Now we go to the right side. Is the FEV1 over FVC low? If it is not low or if it is normal, it can either be a normal spirometric finding or a restrictive ventilatory defect. To verify, you have to look at the value of the FVC. If the FVC is low, then it is a restrictive ventilatory defect. And you have to confirm it using a lung volume study and look at the value of the total lung capacity. If the total lung capacity is decreased, then it is a restrictive ventilatory defect. So, if the FVC is normal, then it is a normal spirometric findings. Another important laboratory examination is your arterial blood gas. ABG and oximetry may demonstrate resting or exertional hypoxemia. ABG may provide additional information on the ventilation and acid-base status. It can also classify ventilatory failure if the PCO2 is more than 45 into an acute with acidemia or pH less than 7.35 or chronic without acidemia but with an elevated bicarbonate. CBC, you can see an elevated hematocrit suggestive of a chronic hypoxemia in the presence of signs of right ventricular hypertrophy. A chest radiograph can assist in the classification of the type of COPD. In emphysema, you will see obvious bullae, paucity of parenchymal markings, and hyperlucency on chest X-ray. Hyperinflation is seen as an increased lung volume and flattening of the diaphragm. Radiography. On PA view, you will see hyperlucency on both the lower lobes with paucity of vascular markings, and these are your bullae. The signs of hyperinflation is the flattening of the diaphragm and the widening of the intercostal space. On lateral view, you will see a flattened diaphragm and a widened retrosternal airspace, which are signs of hyperinflation. Other ancillary procedures like your computed tomography is the current definitive test to establish the presence of emphysema. It can determine the pattern of emphysema and the presence of significant disease of the medium and large airways. It also enables the discovery of an coexisting interstitial lung disease or bronchiectasis. It can likewise screen for lung cancer and help determine possible value of surgical therapy. This high-resolution CT scan of the chest shows enlarged respiratory air spaces posteriorly in both lung fields representing emphysema. The posterior location of the lesions in the upper portions of both lower lobes suggests that the emphysema is Sentry-Assigner in type. Now we go to the clinical evaluation of COPD. First, we have to assess the symptoms using the COPD assessment test or the MMRC breathlessness scale. This is the COPD assessment test. There are 8 variables and the highest score is 40. The higher the score, the greater is the severity of the symptoms and the greater is the impairment in the physical activity. This is the Modified Medical Research Council Disney scale. It is graded 0 to grade 4. The higher the grade, the higher is the level of breathlessness. After assessing the symptoms, Next, we will assess the degree of airflow limitation using spirometry. This is the classification of severity of airflow limitation in COPD. So, FEV1 over FVC should be less than 0.70 in all patients with COPD. Gold 1 is mild with an FEV1 more than or equal to 80% predicted. Gold 2 is moderate with FEV1 between 50 to 79% predicted. Gold 3 is severe with FEV1 30% to 49% predicted, and Gold 4 is very severe with FEV1 less than 30% predicted. And these are all based on post-bronchodilator FEV1. To better understand how to classify the severity of your COPD patient, let's have this case. A 65-year-old with a 45-pack-year smoking history came back with the result of his PFT. The PFT showed the following: FEV1 48% predicted, FVC 90% predicted, FEV1 over FVC of 53. Post-bronchodilator PFT showed FEV1 49% predicted, FVC 90% predicted, and FEV1 over FVC of 54. Classify the severity of airflow limitation. So, to classify the severity, we look at the FEV1, post-bronchodilator FEV1. So the post-bronchodilator FEV1 is 79% predicted. So if it is 79% predicted, the severity of the COPD is severe. This is Gold 3, severe COPD. After assessing the symptoms and the degree of airflow limitation using spirometry, next we have to assess the risk of exacerbations. To assess the risk of exacerbations, we have to use the history of exacerbations and spirometry. 2 exacerbations or more within the last year, or an FEV1 less than 50% predicted value are indicators of high risk. 1 or more hospitalizations due to COPD exacerbation is considered as high risk. An exacerbation of COPD is defined as an acute event characterized by a worsening of the patient's respiratory symptoms that is beyond normal day-to-day variations and lead to a change in medication. This is the refined ABCD assessment tool. First, you have to confirm the diagnosis of COPD with spirometry with post-bronchodilator FEV1 over FVC less than 0.7. Then, you assess the severity of the airflow limitation if it is Gold 1, 2, 3, or 4 based on the level of the FEV1% predicted. Then, you assess the severity of exacerbation history together with the assessment of the symptoms using the MMRC and the CAT score. COPD-A, you have an MMRC 0 to 1 or a CAT score less than 10 with 0 to 1 exacerbation not leading to hospital admission. COPD-B, you have an MMRC more than or equal to 2 with a CAT score more than and equal to 10 with 0 to 1 exacerbation not leading to hospital admission. COPD-C, you have an MMRC 0 to 1 and a CAT score less than 10, but you have more than or equal to 2 or more than or equal to 1 exacerbation leading to hospital admission. COPD-D with MMRC more than or equal to 2 and CAT score more than or equal to 10, but with more than or equal to 1 exacerbation or more than or equal to 1 exacerbation leading to hospital admission. To better understand the ABCD assessment tool, let us have this case. A 60-year-old male non-COPD patient consulted because of on and off dyspnea, especially during walking, and has to stop for breath after walking about 100 meters. It was accompanied by productive cough with whitish phlegm. History also revealed 2 episodes of exacerbation since last year. PFT showed severe airflow obstruction with post-bronchodilator FEV1 49% predicted. Combining all the risk assessments, in what group will this patient belong? So using the PFT of 49, FEV1 49% predicted, this is severe, gold 3. MMRC, walking, and has to stop for breath after walking about 100 meters. The MMRC's grade is 3. And this patient has 2 exacerbations since the last year. So, the patient is classified under Group D, more symptomatic with 2 exacerbations in the last year. So, patient is classified under Group D. Now we go to the treatment of stable COPD. The goals of therapy is to provide symptomatic relief by reducing the respiratory symptoms, improving exercise tolerance, and improving health status. Second is the reduction of future risk of exacerbation by preventing disease progression, preventing and treating exacerbations, and reducing mortality. These are the only 3 interventions that have been demonstrated to improve survival in COPD. First is smoking cessation. Second is oxygen therapy in chronically hypoxemic patients and lung volume reduction surgery. Now let's go to the pharmacotherapy in COPD. Combining pharmacotherapy with supportive approaches enhances the chance of successful smoking cessation. The first of the drugs in COPD are the bronchodilators, which are the mainstay in the management of COPD patients. This is a primary therapy for almost all patients with COPD for symptomatic benefit and for the reduction of exacerbation. The inhaled route is the preferred route to avoid side effects. Under the bronchodilators, you have regular long-acting agents and, as needed, short-acting medications. The first group of bronchodilators, we have beta agonists. So, under beta agonists, you have your short-acting beta agonist, which eases symptoms with acute improvement in lung function. The second is the long-acting beta-2 agonist, which provides symptomatic benefit and reduce exacerbations. Currently available LABA are formoterol, indacaterol, olodaterol, salmeterol, and vilanterol. The side effects of beta agonists include tremor and tachycardia. The next group of bronchodilators are anticholinergic muscarinic antagonists. Under this, you have your short-acting muscarinic antagonist or your SAMA, example of which is your ipratropium, which improves symptoms with acute improvement in your FEV1. Another Example of anticholinergic muscarinic antagonists are your LAMA or your long-acting muscarinic antagonists. Example are your aclidinium, glycopyrronium, tiotropium, and umulidinium. This improves symptoms and reduces exacerbations. Another bronchodilator is a combination of beta-2 agonist and muscarinic antagonist, example of which is your combination of ipratropium and salbutamol. So it improves lung function and reduces exacerbation greater than either agent alone. Another important group of pharmacologic therapy in COPD is the inhaled corticosteroids. The main role is to reduce exacerbation and reduce the decline of lung function. It is considered in patients with frequent exacerbation, more than or equal to 2 exacerbations per year, and those with features of asthma, those COPD patients with eosinophilia. Because of associated increased risk of pneumonia, in stable patients, inhaled corticosteroids may be withdrawn. Other medications include oral glucocorticosteroids. Chronic use of this is not recommended due to unfavorable benefits. Side effects include osteoporosis, weight gain, cataracts, glucose intolerance, increased risk of infections. Another medication is your theophylline, which produces a modest benefit in airflow and vital capacity. This is not a first-line drug due to side effects of nausea, tachycardia, tremors, and other drug interactions. Another group of drug are your PDE4 inhibitors, which is your roflumilast. Roflumilast reduces exacerbation frequency in patients with severe COPD and chronic bronchitis. Another medication is your alpha-1 antitrypsin augmentation therapy, which is specific treatment for patients with severe alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. Now we go to the personalized treatment based on the COPD grouping. All Group A patients should be offered bronchodilator treatment based on its effect on breathlessness. This can either be a short or a long-acting bronchodilator, and this should be continued if benefit is documented. Group B patients, the initial therapy should consist of a LABA or a LAMA. Long-acting inhaled bronchodilators are superior to short-acting bronchodilators taken as needed and are therefore recommended. In Group C, initial therapy should consist of a single long-acting bronchodilator. In a two head-to-head comparisons, the tested LAMA was superior to the LABA regarding exacerbation prevention. Therefore, it is recommended to start with LAMA in Group C. In Group D, in general, therapy can be started with a LAMA as it has effects on both breathlessness and exacerbations. For patients with more severe symptoms, with CAT score more than or equal to 20, especially those with greater dyspnea and exercise limitation, LAMA plus LABA may be chosen as initial treatment based on studies with patient-reported outcomes as the primary endpoint, where LABA-LAMA combinations showed superior results compared to the single substances. An advantage of LAMA-LABA over LAMA alone for exacerbation prevention has not been consistently demonstrated, so the decision to use LABA-LAMA as initial treatment should be guided by the level of symptoms. In some patients under Group D, initial therapy with LABA-ICS may be the first choice. This treatment has the greatest likelihood of reducing exacerbations in patients with blood eosinophil counts more than or equal to 300 cells per microliter. LABA-ICS may also be the first choice in COPD patients with a history of asthma. ICS may cause side effects such as pneumonia. It is used as an initial therapy only after the possible clinical benefits versus risk have been considered. The follow-up pharmacological treatment algorithm can be applied to any patient who is already taking maintenance treatments, irrespective of the goal group allocated at treatment initiation. The need to treat primarily dyspnea or exercise limitation or prevent exacerbation further should be evaluated. If a change in treatment is considered necessary, then select the corresponding algorithm for dyspnea or for exacerbations. For the dyspnea algorithm, for patients with persistent breathlessness or exercise limitation on LABA monotherapy, the use of 2 bronchodilators is recommended. If the addition of a second LABA does not improve symptoms, we suggest the treatment should be stepped down again to monotherapy. Switching inhaler device or molecules can also be considered. For patients with persistent breathlessness or exercise limitation on LABA-ICS treatment, LAMA can be added to escalate to triple therapy. Alternatively, switching from LABA-ICS to LABA-LAMA should be considered if the original indication for ICS was inappropriate, or there has been a lack of response to ICS treatment, or if ICS side effects warrant discontinuation. At all stages, dyspnea due to other causes should be investigated and treated appropriately. For the exacerbation algorithm, for patients with persistent exacerbation on long-acting bronchodilator monotherapy, escalation to either LABA-LAMA or LABA-ICS is recommended. LABA-ICS may be preferred for patients with a history or findings suggestive of asthma. Blood eosinophil counts may identify patients with a greater likelihood of a beneficial response to ICS. For patients with 1 exacerbation per year, a peripheral blood level of more than or equal to 300 eosinophils per microliter identifies patients more likely to respond to LABA-ICS treatment. For patients with more than or equal to 2 moderate exacerbations per year, or at least 1 severe exacerbation requiring hospitalization in the prior year, LABA-ICS treatment can be considered at blood eosinophil counts more than or equal to 100 cells per microliter, as ICS effects are more pronounced in patients with greater exacerbation frequency and/or severity. In patients who develop further exacerbations on LABA-LAMA therapy, we suggest 2 alternative pathways. Blood eosinophil counts less than 100 cells per microliter can be used to predict a low likelihood of a beneficial ICS response. Then, you escalate to LABA-LAMA ICS. A beneficial response after the addition of ICS may be observed at blood eosinophil counts more than or equal to 100 cells per microliter, with a greater magnitude of response more likely with higher eosinophil counts. Add proflumilas or azithromycin if blood eosinophils is less than 100 cells per microliter. If in patients who develop further exacerbations on LABA-ICS therapy, we recommend escalation to triple therapy by adding LAMA. Alternatively, treatment can be switched to LABA-LAMA if there has been a lack of response to ICS treatment or if ICS side effects warrant discontinuation. If patients treated with LABA-LAMA ICS who still have exacerbations, the following options may be considered. Adding roflumilast. This may be considered in patients with an FEV1 less than 50% predicted and chronic bronchitis, particularly if they have experienced at least one hospitalization for an exacerbation in the previous year. Another is add a macrolide. The best available evidence exists for the use of azithromycin, especially in those who are not current smokers. Another, you can stop ICS. This can be considered if there are adverse effects such as pneumonia or a reported lack of efficacy. However, a blood eosinophil count more than or equal to 300 cells per microliter identifies patients with the greatest likelihood of experiencing more exacerbations after ICS withdrawal and who subsequently should be followed closely for relapse of exacerbations. Non-pharmacologic therapy include pulmonary rehabilitation. This is a comprehensive treatment program that incorporates exercise, education, psychosocial, and nutritional counseling. This has been demonstrated to improve health-related quality of life, dyspnea and exercise capacity, and reduce rate of hospitalization. Another non-pharmacologic therapy is your lung volume reduction surgery. In carefully selected patients with emphysema, surgery to remove the most emphysematous portions of the lung improves exercise, lung function, and survival. Another non-pharmacologic therapy is lung transplantation. COPD is the second leading indication for lung transplantation. Candidates for lung transplantation should have very severe airflow limitation, severe disability despite maximal therapy, and free of significant comorbid conditions. Long-term oxygen therapy is indicated for stable patients who have PaO2 at or below 55 mm mercury or oxygen saturation at or below 88% with or without hypercapnia confirmed twice over a 3-week period, or a PO2 between 55 mm mercury and 60 mm mercury, or oxygen saturation of 88% if there is evidence of pulmonary hypertension, peripheral edema suggesting congestive cardiac failure, or polycythemia with hematocrit of more than 55%. Now we go to the exacerbations of COPD. Exacerbation means there is an episodic acute worsening of respiratory symptoms. You have an increased dyspnea, cough, wheezing, and or change in the amount or character of sputum. Frequency of exacerbations increases as airflow obstruction worsens. Patients with severe or very severe airflow obstruction on average have 1 to 3 episodes of exacerbations per year. Common causes of exacerbations are bacterial infection. Superinfection is involved in more than 50% of exacerbations, viral infections in 1/3 of cases. In assessing patients with acute exacerbations of COPD, you have to establish the severity of exacerbation and the severity of pre-existing COPD. In the history, you have to quantify the degree and the change in dyspnea and breathlessness. Ask for fever, change in the character of sputum, associated symptoms such as wheezing, myalgia, and chills. On physical examination, you have to assess the degree of respiratory distress, tachycardia, tachypnea, use of accessory muscles, perioral or peripheral cyanosis, ability to speak, and mental status. On chest examination, you assess for symmetry, wheezing, and paradoxical motion of the abdominal wall. On chest X-ray or chest CT scan, the most frequent findings are pneumonia and congestive heart failure. Arterial blood gas should be done for advanced COPD, history of hypercarbia, mental status changes, or significant respiratory distress. Inpatient or hospital treatment is needed in patients with respiratory acidosis and hypercarbia, new or worsening hypoxemia, severe underlying lung disease, living condition not conducive to observation and treatment. Mainstay of treatment for exacerbation are your bronchodilators. Treatment with beta-2 agonists and muscarinic antagonists, given separately or together, are the mainstays in the treatment of acute exacerbations. The frequency depends on the severity of exacerbation. Patients are often treated initially with nebulized therapy. Conversion to metered dose inhalers are effective when accompanied by education and training of patient and staff. Methylxanthines like your theophylline can be considered, but proof of efficacy is lacking. Patients with COPD are frequently colonized with potential respiratory pathogens. Bacteria frequently implicated are Streptococcus pneumoniae, Haemophilus influenza, and Moraxella catarrhalis. In addition, Mycoplasma pneumoniae and Chlamydia pneumoniae may also be implicated. Choice of antibiotics should be based on local patterns of susceptibility of the above pathogens. One of the cornerstones in the management of acute exacerbation of COPD are your systemic glucocorticoids. This reduces the length of stay, hastens recovery, and reduces subsequent exacerbation or relapse. Current recommendation for outpatients, we have 30 to 40 mg oral prednisolone or equivalent for 5 to 10 days. Hyperglycemia is the most frequent acute complication. Supplemental oxygen therapy should be given to maintain oxygen saturation more than or equal to 90%. The giving of oxygen therapy may result in modest increase in your PCO2, but it should not deter you from providing oxygen to correct hypoxemia. These are the key points for the management of exacerbations. Short-acting inhaled beta-2 agonists with or without short-acting anticholinergics are recommended as the initial bronchodilators to treat an acute exacerbation. Systemic corticosteroids can improve lung function, oxygenation, and shorten recovery time and hospitalization duration. Duration of therapy should not be more than 5 to 7 days. Antibiotics, when indicated, can shorten recovery time, reduce the risk of early relapse, treatment failure, and hospitalization duration. Duration of antibiotic therapy should be 5 to 7 days. Methylxanthines are not recommended due to increased side effect profiles. Non-invasive mechanical ventilation should be the first mode of ventilation used in COPD patients with acute respiratory failure who have no absolute contraindication because it improves gas exchange, reduces work of breathing and the need for intubation, decreases hospitalization duration, and improves survival. These are the indications for non-invasive mechanical ventilation. At least one of the following: respiratory acidosis, PCO2 more than 45 mm mercury, and arterial pH less than or equal to 7.35. Severe dyspnea with clinical signs suggestive of respiratory muscle fatigue, increased work of breathing, or both, such as use of respiratory accessory muscles, paradoxical motion of the abdomen, or retraction of the intercostal spaces. Third is persistent hypoxemia despite supplemental oxygen therapy. This is a picture of a patient with non-invasive ventilation. The interface is a full face mask. These are the contraindications for non-invasive ventilation: patient respiratory arrest, cardiovascular instability, patient with hypotension, arrhythmias, and myocardial infarction. Third, somnolence, impaired mental status, and an uncooperative patient. High risk aspiration with copious secretions, recent facial or gastroesophageal surgery, craniofacial trauma, fixed nasopharyngeal abnormality, burns, and extreme obesity. This is a picture of an invasive mechanical ventilation. Invasive in the sense that an endotracheal tube is inserted. These are the indications for invasive mechanical ventilation: severe dyspnea with use of accessory muscles and paradoxical abdominal motion, respiratory frequency more than 35 breaths per minute, life-threatening hypoxemia, PaO2 less than 40 or a PF ratio less than 200, severe acidosis with pH less than 7.25, and hypercapnia with PCO2 more than 60, respiratory arrest, somnolence, impaired mental status, cardiovascular instability, and failure of non-invasive ventilation with no improvement after 2 hours on non-invasive ventilation. These are indications for invasive mechanical ventilation based on the 2020 Global Initiative for Chronic Obstructive Lung Disease. First is unable to tolerate NIV or NIV failure, status post-respiratory or cardiac arrest, diminished consciousness, psychomotor agitation, inadequately controlled by sedation, massive aspiration or persistent vomiting, persistent inability to remove respiratory secretions, severe hemodynamic instability without response to fluids and vasoactive drugs, severe ventricular or supraventricular arrhythmias, and life-threatening hypoxemia in patients unable to tolerate non-invasive ventilation. This ends my lecture. Thank you for listening.